So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual performance by the Shreveport Symphony of Appalachian Spring of Aaron Copland, and also two works that begin the program of a very different feel, one by George Walker and one by Dimitri Shastakovic. Now in fact, when you look at the program at first glance, it might seem that the character of these pieces is so very different that they sort of don't make a unit, but I think they do, because I think they are reflective of where we are as a society right now emotionally. We are right now just about 1 year into the experience of the pandemic, and it has been a year marked by loss, tragic loss in some cases, and more, I suppose, mundane loss in other cases, just the loss of the experience of gathering together, the loss of the experience of traveling and just doing things in ways that we were very much used to. Even gathering for concerts, of course, is an example of that. And yet, as I'm speaking to you now, we are on the eve, I think, of the approval of a third vaccine for this virus. We are seeing infection rates continuing to fall. We're seeing good compliance with public health measures. There is the widespread expectation that as we get into the spring and into the early summer, vaccines are going to be widely available. And so there is certainly a great deal of optimism and hope right now that many of us are feeling, that brighter days are indeed ahead. And so the program reflects that, I suppose, pivot point. We have the first two works, which are very much coming from a perspective of loss on the part of the composers. And then we have Appalachian Spring, which is really all about renewal and beginnings and optimism for the future. So let's consider the first two works first. They were both originally written as string quartets and later converted into works for string orchestra by means of adding a bass part, for example. The first one by the composer and the second one by an arranger later on. The first work we're going to play is called The Lyric for Strings by George Walker. George Walker was one of the most important American composers of the really the last half of the 20th century primarily. He was the first African-American composer first living African-American composer to win a Pulitzer Prize back in 1996, I believe. This work, however, dates from relatively early in his career, early in his life. He was just 24 years old when he wrote this piece, which, as I said, was originally the second movement of a string quartet. And he realized that it was potent emotionally and spoke to people. And he later arranged it for string orchestra and added the title Lyric for Strings, suggesting a song-like quality to it. It is often compared to Barbour's Adagio for strings, and it's easy to understand why. The texture is the same, string orchestra. They're both slow, and they are exploring some darker colors, minor keys, and so on. But this piece, to me, is quite a bit more tuneful and even brighter, has much more moments, greater number of moments in major keys than we hear in Samuel Barbour's Adagio for strings. George Walker dedicated this to the memory of his maternal grandmother, who had passed away just shortly before he wrote the work, and always referred to this as his grandmother's piece. And so it is really an elegy, I think it's fair to say. And it is a very personal one, one of a sense of remembrance of someone who is no longer with the composer. So there's a sense of loss. I think there's also a sense of perhaps nostalgia or maybe fondness for the memories that he's continuing to carry with him in his heart. So then after that relatively short piece, about 6 minutes, we are going to play the Chamber Symphony of Dimitri Shastakovic, which was originally written as his String Quartet number 8. Now, back in 1960, Shastakovic went to Dresden to, ostensibly anyway, begin to write music for a film that was to concern itself with some of the, I guess it was the Nazi pillaging, I suppose, of some of the artworks, the treasures that were in Dresden prior to World War II. But when he got there, Shastakovich felt unable to focus on that project. He instead was struck, I think, by the sense of destruction all around him. The city was, after all, firebombed by the Allies in rather dramatic ways and with a tremendous sense of destruction that was still quite apparent 16 years or so after it had happened. And Shastakovich felt compelled to write this, what turned out to be a string quartet. He did it in just 3 days, and he actually used a number of works that he had previously composed. He quotes little bits of them in this. He said that this was dedicated to the victims of fascism. But in the case of Shastakovich, there's always a question about whether the official dedication and inscription and so on is authentic, or whether it was perhaps given to please the potential censors or government authorities that held a great deal of sway over Shostakovich's both creative life and frankly his personal life, his freedom. He said privately that this was a piece that he dedicated to himself. And I think it's also fair to say that he probably considered himself to be a victim of, if not fascism in the strictest sense, certainly authoritarianism and totalitarianism. He was very much oppressed by the Stalinist regime that had existed in the 40s and 50s. And I'm sure, thought of himself as a victim of that kind of authoritarian rule. And we know this is a very personal piece for him because he writes his name into it in all sorts of ways. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, Shostakovich's name in Cyrillic, after all, that's how it's written, or how it was given to him, is here, Shastakovich. In Roman alphabet, not Cyrillic alphabet, in Roman alphabet, in English, we transliterate that this way, S-H-O-S-T, and so on. However, in German, they transliterate it slightly differently. I don't know if you can see this or if it's in focus. I hope it doesn't seem to be, but in any case, it's Dimitri and S-C-H-O-S-T-A-K-O-W-I-T-S-C-H. But the point of that is that if you consider the first letter of his first name and the first 3 letters of his second name, his last name, S-C-H in this case, we have D-S-C-H, which can actually be translated, you see those 4 notes rather, into musical pitches. The D and the C are probably obvious enough. The S and the H are a little bit confusing perhaps, but S, E-S, is the German name for E flat, S. If you were to pronounce it, E-S, it would sound like S, sound like the letter S. And the letter H is what is used for B natural. They use the letter B to mean B flat in German, and H means B natural. You want to know why? You may not, but I'm going to tell you. So follow me down this rabbit hole just for a moment. It really goes back to the Middle Ages, to manuscripts in which the note B flat was written with a kind of curved or soft-looking B, and the note B natural was indicated with a B that had essentially straight lines. So if you can see this, I don't know if you can. Make sure I'm looking at the right thing here. Yes. So this indicates hard B, which you can see is a bunch of straight lines. It looks like a lowercase b, but it's all straight lines. This is soft B, if you will. And these have morphed into our symbols for, in the case of soft B, into the symbol for the flat, and in the case of hard B, into the symbol for either sharp or natural, depending on how you might look at it. And I could go into more detail that has to do with the medieval theory of hexachords and the natural hexachord and the soft hexachord and the hard hexachord. We won't need to go into that, but in any case, let's just suffice it to say it was kind of like a misreading of what was supposed to be a B. It got misread as an H, and it just has stuck. In any case, people like Bach made hay with that, because B-A-C-H could be translated into notes that way, and in this case, Dimitri Shastakovic, D-S-C-H can as well. So, what does that sound like? It sounds like this. D, E flat, C, B natural. And that motive is heard throughout this piece. We hear it at the very beginning of the symphony. It sounds like this. That's the basses and cellos, and the viola comes in. And finally the first violins. So the first movement is certainly slow and built on those four notes quite prominently. There is a moment midway through where things get even quieter than they begin, and we hear a theme that is from his Fifth Symphony. It's heard in his Fifth Symphony in a number of ways. It's heard very quietly and sort of gently. It's also heard almost as a triumphant theme later on, but we hear it in its quiet version here. In this symphony. Sort of led into it. And here's the theme I'm talking about. Just sort of that line floating above the rest of the orchestra that is played by the first violins. The first movement, all the movements are really connected to one another, essentially without pause. This first movement ends with a G sharp that is sustained and then grows in intensity, and it just sort of explodes into the second movement, which is really just a fast, frantic kind of scherzo. With a lot of really strong bow strokes. There's a great sense of anger, I think, or aggression, violence almost, in this second movement. There is a quotation from his E minor piano trio that we hear a couple of times. First time it comes along with in C minor, and the low strings are playing. And so on. Then we hear that come back later on in the low strings. They play it in a slightly different key. But then we go really more or less directly into the beginning of the third movement, which feels like a scherzo, or it might be almost a waltz. But it begins with the same D-S-C-H. It's faster than we've heard it before. By the way, that D-S-C-H motive is actually heard in that second movement a few times. It's a little more hidden, but it is in there. But the third movement begins very clearly with the a sort of faster version of this D-S-C-H. And there's a chromatic line that goes down in the first violins, and then it turns into a little oompa thing. And that melody in the violins is D-S-C-H. So again, he's modified that motive, that motto motive, in another way. Now, there's a lyrical theme that we hear in the middle, which is based on the open strings of the violin. And they play. Sort of rising up through the instrument, you might say. There's a beautiful cello solo that's played over a kind of chromatic, almost feels like the wind howling through the trees, that is played by the upper strings, but the main interest is in the cello solo. You'll hear that later on in that third movement. The third movement just ends with the softly sustained A sharp in the strings, and then it is interrupted incredibly violently and rudely by these hammer strokes, you might say. There's different ideas as to what that might represent, but it is indeed very aggressive and violent. And then we hear and again. Some people have said it is the pounding at the door of the East German secret police, the Stasi, or maybe in Shastakovic's case it's the KGB, but it's sort of the idea there is that it is this sort of terror that one might feel about being watched over one's shoulder perpetually. Or other people have said this sort of sustained A sharp that's very soft and sort of in the background represented maybe the sound of distant airplanes, and then these were gunshots. Different ways of, I suppose, interpreting it. Shastakovic himself didn't tell us what he thought. But that A sharp then turns into, which is very much clearly meant to represent the notes of what's called a dies irae, which is a part of the Roman Catholic Requiem Mass for the dead, and it is Day of Wrath is the text there. So we hear those four notes. It goes back to this G sharp again, and then we hear a melody that sounds like this, played all in octaves by the low strings. Is a Russian funeral hymn or anthem, the text of which is translated, and I'm reading here, tormented by the weight of bondage, you glorify death with honor. The audience that would have heard this would have been familiar with the meaning behind the reference being made by that melody, even if those of us in the West are generally not. Another cello solo later on in that movement, and then at the end, a D sharp gets turned into, again, a quotation of a dies irae, which then gets turned itself back into DSCH. And then we open the last movement with that main theme being the subject. And then we have these, what are called Appoggiaturas, which is like a dissonant note that then resolves. And it's really that harmonic tension that is the focus of this last movement, which is kind of a counterpart to the opening, I think. You could say they sort of bookend the symphony. Maybe it's a bit of an epilogue or an elegy somehow. But just an incredibly powerful piece. It's exhausting to play. It's exhausting to experience, quite frankly. If you are connected emotionally with this piece, you feel that you've been through something by the time it's over, even though it's only about 21 minutes or so. So we'll take a little pause after that, reset the stage a bit, and then we're going to play for you the original version of Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring, or actually the suite from his ballet Appalachian Spring. Now he wrote this in 1944, or that was when it was first performed, on a commission from Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. It was performed at the Library of Congress initially, and written for Martha Graham. In fact, he titled the work Ballet for Martha, not really giving it the title Appalachian Spring until a little bit later on. He took that title from a line in a Hart Crane poem, if I'm not mistaken, that refers to, in that case, a spring out of the ground, not actually this season of spring. However, the story behind the ballet is one that does take place in springtime in the early 1800s in Appalachia, western Pennsylvania. It concerns itself with the doings of a young couple who are newly married and who are embarking on their lives together. They're meeting some of the folks who are living in this pioneer town with them. And there is a real sense of Americana about this piece, a real sense of, I think, positivity and openness. And Copland had a way of writing melodies and creating textures that feel to us kind of American, and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what is responsible for that, but the general consensus is that it is his use of what we would call wide open spacing of the melodies that he writes, so that we don't have a lot of, but we have a lot of that sort of expansiveness, and that is, I guess, one might say, a reflection of the expansiveness of this country, and especially as it was growing throughout the 19th century in particular. So it opens very calmly and simply, just in A major, just 2 notes, or actually 3 notes, and the clarinet comes in. He says to play this with a white tone. In other words, not much color, not much vibrato. So it just kind of sort of puts you at ease or at rest somehow as you're listening at the beginning. It's a calming, it's slow, it's not loud, the intervals are wide open. Now later on it gets very aggressive. There are a lot of jagged, uneven meters that we encounter, lots of almost syncopated and vaguely jazzy feeling moments, although I wouldn't really think that he was trying to recall the sense of jazz at all. He does, in one place, quote an actual American tune, in this case the Shaker hymn, Simple Gifts. And he writes a series of variations on that melody. That's, in a way, I think, the climax or the peak of the work, about 7/8 of the way through. And then it ends with a return, really kind of almost an epilogue that feels like a prayer, and is again reflective of the beginning, the mood of the beginning of the piece. So like the Shastakovic, I guess you could say it's bookended, in this case by sort of calm and serenity. But it is a work that is familiar to audiences and to the orchestra. However, most often it is heard in its full orchestra version. Copland wrote this originally for just 13 instruments. So 2 violins, well, 2 first violins, 2 second violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos, 1 bass, and then a flute, clarinet, and bassoon, and piano. That's it. And so that's how we're presenting it to you this evening, the way that Copland heard it initially. And of course it matches very well with the conditions at the moment in which we're trying to maintain appropriate distance and space between one another. But we are very glad to be playing music together. We're very glad to be sharing music with you. And I thank you for joining me for this pre-concert chat. And I certainly hope that you enjoy the performance. Enjoy this performance and then join us again in March, on March 13th, beginning on March 13th, for a ragtime program dedicated to primarily Scott Joplin. So we'll see you then.